Well, welcome to Christian Answers. My name is Pastor Jeff Short, and today we're going to continue to be talking about Jarrid Wilson, the pastor out in California, who unfortunately took his own life at age 30. And we have been like a week or so, a week and a half since his passing, and the church out there in Harvest Christian Fellowship in Riverside, California, Senior Pastor Greg Laurie has given his Sunday sermons, a couple of them since Jarrid's death. Jarrid was a staff pastor at Harvest Christian Fellowship, and the last video I made, I raised some questions about Jarrid Wilson, really to only help us understand him better, and ultimately to help someone who might be in a similar situation as him, who is struggling with the same problem he was struggling, to try to better help people to prevent this from happening. And I wanted to do another video on still more questions about Jarrid Wilson and his situation, because again, we don't know very much about the man, Jarrid Wilson. We don't know much about his situation. We know a little bit about what he has been going through. We know he's 30 years old. We know that he became a Christian, I think, about 7 or 8 years ago, and that he came to Christ in the midst of his struggle with mental illness, and that this large megachurch pastored by Greg Laurie out Harvest Christian Fellowship in Riverside, California, hired him to help with the ministry out there and to specialize in helping people with mental illnesses. And so he had a lot of things going on. He was somewhat of a national speaker on mental health issues in the church. You know, and mind you, this is 30, he's only 30 years old. I don't know what kind of education that he had. I don't know if he really was trained in theology, went to seminary or Bible college. I don't know his educational background. I would hope, if he's going to be pastoring a huge mega church, that he would have a strong theological and ministry educational background. I would hope that would be the case, but I have a suspicion, I have a feeling that probably it was not the case. But he had a lot of passion, he had a lot of enthusiasm. Greg Laurie described him as upbeat, positive, energetic, passionate about his ministry. If you go on the YouTube website, you will find that he is frequently speaking in front of large audiences. He's talking like any other young pastor would be. Seems to have no evident outward problems speaking or communicating or actually, dealing with problems. But we do know that he was on antidepressant medication. We do know that he was under supposedly a doctor's care, a physician's care. We do know that the pastors at Harvest Christian Fellowship knew of his struggle and knew of his personal problems, and certainly his wife knew. And so there were people in his life that were aware of the problems that he faced and were evidently helping him and encouraging him. And so that's why he was allowed to be in ministry. But I have some questions, some more questions I want to raise. And they're not criticisms more than just questions being raised so that then the answers can be researched. We can uncover what actually drove him to do what he did so that we can prevent someone else from doing that. In other words, what's to prevent another staff pastor out of a megachurch from committing suicide, or what's to prevent any other pastor, for that means, from doing the same thing. So we want to understand what his problem was. What was he facing? What did he undergo that would cause him to do such a radical thing. You know, when you think of pastors, when you think of ministers, when you think of spiritual leaders, these are supposed to be the cream of the crop. These are supposed to be the most mature people in the Christian community, because then they can minister and they can help other people and they can give out of themselves without being depleted, or they don't require a lot of care and counseling and help themselves, so they can give out of what they know. And we would assume that they are people who can go to God's Word and get the promises of God for their own lives, and that they can do self-care because of their maturity level. That's what we would assume. And we have a right to assume that, because there are qualifications for pastors and teachers and elders in the church, and they're strict, and they're more strict than they are for a regular Christian church member. So we would assume that pastors and church leaders and elders, because they have had to go through more strict requirements than the regular Christians in the church community, they would be more mature, and that they would not go through these things. One of the comments I know that came from Greg Laurie, whom I respect and I've listened to over the last 20 years. I think I've even met him in Colorado Springs when he was doing a harvest crusade there in the early 2000s or late 90s, I think it was. And I met him, respect him, appreciate him, and felt that his ministry was pretty balanced and that he was fairly inspiring to listen to. And I remember him, one of the messages that he gave over the last few days was that, pastors are put up on the pedestal. They're seen as these superheroes and supermen, but that's not the case, and that pastors are people too, and they go through the same struggles, and they go through the same problems. I wanted to say yes and no. That's true. Some people put pastors up on the pedestals, and unfortunately pastors actually let them do that, or even encourage them to do that, because after all, we're all fallen, sinful people. And when a pastor is built up and puffed up, they like it. They feel good. That's, self-esteem, ego. We all struggle with that. Everyone has an ego, and everyone likes to be told they're great, and they're a great speaker, and they're so kind and nice and understanding and sensitive. And pastors are put up on the pedestal, and pastors put themselves on the pedestal, and then so there is a problem with that, and we need to be aware of that. But on the other hand, no, pastors aren't just like everybody else. They aren't just your run-of-the-mill Christian in maturity level, knowledge of the Bible, ability to give and not have to receive as much. No, that's why they're put in positions of leadership, because they are the cream of the crop. They are the more mature people. And so we put them in higher positions of responsibility because we feel they can handle those responsibilities. Now, one of the comments that I heard that was posted on the CBN News, Newswatch, and the podcast about cultural issues on the CBN News, Christian Broadcasting Network News, and there was a conversation between two gentlemen, the newscaster and then another pastor, and the pastor was, and I felt a little bit unfairly, he was criticizing the staff at Harvest Chapel, Harvest Bible Christian Fellowship in Riverside. He was saying, why are we putting pastors who have a history of mental illness in positions of leadership, especially at higher levels, where they're actually speaking in front of thousands of people like Jarrid Wilson did, and where they're put in high-profile leadership positions, where they're busy all the time because of all the people that attend these churches. Why are pastors being shoved into ministry positions and why are people specifically who are known to have, say, depression, anxiety disorders, who are on medication for these problems, why are they thrust into public ministry at high levels and that require high levels of achievement, high levels of performance, and they're under the microscope, they're under the gun, rush, rush, rush. Why did Jarrid Wilson get hired in as a staff pastor, and why was he put in a position where he could get himself over his head as far as his schedule, his busyness, pressure, etc.? And I don't feel that that is actually a fair criticism, but it does raise a question. What were the conditions for Jarrid Wilson's employment at Harvest Christian Fellowship? Were there conditions? It was clear and obvious beforehand that Jarrid Wilson had a mental illness. He had suffered from depression. I believe he had thoughts of suicide before. I think that comes out in some of the articles that he had considered and thought of suicide. I'm not exactly sure whether he had ever attempted suicide directly, but it was widely known before he became a pastor at Harvest Christian Fellowship that he did suffer from depression and anxiety, and he was on medications. So the question is, what were the conditions of his employment? And was there someone on staff who would directly take responsibility for monitoring his condition? If you have someone who has a mental illness and you hire them to a high-profile public position, and I would assume that there would be someone, it wouldn't necessarily be Pastor Greg Laurie himself. He's the senior pastor, senior and founding pastor of Harvest Christian Fellowship in Riverside, California, as well as some other, I believe they have some campus church ministries also. So it wouldn't have to be, or probably wasn't, Pastor Greg Laurie, but was there someone on staff who directly supervised Jarrid Wilson and monitored his health, and was there supposedly to make sure that he didn't get in over his head? He's only 30 years old. Again, you have to take into consideration the youth and inexperience of this man. And so I would assume that there would be an older and wiser gentleman, pastor on staff, who would be able to hold him accountable and to monitor his progress. Because after all, he has a mental illness. It's known. He's on medication. And so he's under doctor care. We're told that he was under a physician's care. So was there someone at the church who was given the responsibility to make sure to take Jarrid under his wing, to monitor his activity, to make sure he wasn't too busy, too involved, or that his moods were not swinging too violently, and so on and so forth? Those are good questions. So we'll have to find out. Maybe someone will address these issues at Harvest Christian Fellowship. It would be nice if we could get Pastor Greg Laurie and the staff people to actually explain, what were the terms and conditions of Jarrid Wilson's employment, and why was he hired, and was there concern about his condition, and what was being done to help monitor and watch him closely. On the other hand, when you bring someone on staff at a church, you can't watch them 24/7. It's not your responsibility to watch them 24/7. If someone is across the room or the table from you and you're talking about coming on staff and helping people, I'm sure he was brought on staff to help other people because of his unique position as being someone who suffers from mental illness, depression, anxiety. He was brought on staff to help people, younger people especially, who were dealing with these problems, and a lot of good could come about. Now, a lot of good has come about in the ministry of Jarrid Wilson, if I'm not mistaken. He has been instrumental in helping a lot of people dealing with these issues. So, yeah, I can understand exactly why he was brought on. The question that I'm raising, though, is one of, was there anyone there who was charged at the church with watching him, and very closely because of his unique situation? On the other hand, people who are brought on staff and who claim to be handling their situation, like Jarrid says, he's okay, I'm under physician's care, I'm on medication, that kind of thing. Is it really the pastor's responsibility to watch him 24/7, follow him around? And I'm sure it would be very hard to tell him, hey, you need to shut down for a month or so. It seems to be that you're not able to handle these things. If an adult is telling you they're okay and they've got it and things are under control, and his wife is watching him, family members, friends, how much can a pastor, a staff pastor in a church do in preventing something like this? I'm sure something, but not very much. So the question then would be, is there something that Harvest Christian Fellowship staff could have done to prevent this? Maybe, maybe not. We'll have to find out. Now, another thing that I have a question about is that in the days that followed Jarrid Wilson's death, a number of people at Harvest Christian Fellowship, I believe Greg Laurie and some other guest speakers who came in, were talking in terms of depression is like cancer. It's a mental illness. It's like a physical illness. When someone has cancer, depression is like that, and so on and so forth. It's a disease that can be caught, and there are people who are now talking in terms of mental illness like a physical illness. They're trying to say, well, we can't look at a mental illness, depression, anxiety, and such in any other way other than, say, like a physical illness, like a disease that attacks the body, or a cancer that attacks the body, and so on and so forth. I'm not exactly sure that actually is true. I'm not exactly sure that the Bible itself classifies disorders of the mind and spiritual disorders as it would physical disorders. If you have a physical disease, because the mental and the spiritual aspect of life has so much to do with the choices we make. Now, that doesn't mean that the physical diseases, like, for example, cancer of the lungs, if you smoke heavily and you do that for decade after decade, yes, you may well develop cancer of the lungs, and then that physical problem is the direct result of your choices, your own personal choices. But I think one of the reasons why people are talking in those terms is that because they want to be nice to the individual who has passed away through, for example, like Jarrid Wilson, through suicide. They're saying, well, this is something that came upon him. This is not something that he had choice of, and we shouldn't blame him or hold him accountable, because this is something like a physical disease that attacked him, and there's nothing he could have done. I don't know. I don't know if there's anything that he could have done, or things that people could have done who are around him, who his friends, his loved ones. I don't know. There probably are some things that could have been done, and that was one of the reasons why there needs to be an exploration by the staff, the pastoral staff at Harvest Christian Fellowship, in saying, should we have employed Jarrid, and should we have put him in these positions of responsibility, knowing that he has a weakness in this area, or should people in his life, his family, his friends, should they have encouraged him to go out and do these things in ministry, even though they're helping people? Yes, but is he really up to that? And should he have been held back by people who love him? Should pastors be placed in positions when it's known that they have mental illness or depression or anxiety? That's a tricky question, because there are people who have had suffered depression and who have suffered anxiety and paranoia and all kinds of other things, who have gotten better and have improved and have learned how to handle it, and now they are in positions of responsibility and they seem to be okay as long as they stay on their medication, which is another question. Was he on his medication? Was Jarrid faithfully taking his medication? Was he faithfully going to his counselor? Was he faithfully and honestly talking with his physician and giving him a real picture of what was going on? These are questions we really don't know. But I think if you have someone who is saying, okay, I've suffered from this problem in the past, but it seems to be fine. I'm able to handle myself through medication and through exercise, or my diet is better now. I'm getting better sleep at night. I'm not under so much stress. I'm able to handle these responsibilities, so on and so forth. Then it's really hard for a church to say, well, no, we're not going to hire you. You're capable. You're qualified. You have all the qualifications, but we're not going to hire you because of this in your life, this in your past. It's very hard for churches to do that. But in wake of Jarrid Wilson, churches might want to take another look and say, well, maybe we'll hire this person, bring them on staff, but we'll put them on probation, or we'll watch them closely, or we'll have some kind of conditions that will help them to not relapse into whatever mental illness that they had suffered from. Now, there is the whole issue of this funeral that Jarrid officiated the very day that he took his life. Should someone who suffered from mental illness, who suffered from depression, who had had suicidal thoughts before in his past, should that person have been giving the funeral of someone who died at the hands of suicide? Really? Seriously? Was there a discussion about this on the staff of Harvest Christian Fellowship? Was there any talk at all? Did he and his wife talk this over? Did anyone, supervisor, talk this over? It seems to me it's pretty clear that this is not something that should be done. You have a person who suffers from depression. You have a person who's on depression medication, who is under a doctor's care and counseling. Officiating at a suicide funeral, I don't think that makes sense. So that's a big question mark. And on reflection, I'm sure people wish that that hadn't taken place. I think in the future, churches should really have an accountability about what activities people undergo that have had weaknesses in the past in that area. For example, if you're if you're an alcoholic and you're a recovering alcoholic, and you're not going to have a ministry where you're going into bars and ministering to people who are drunks for obvious reasons. So I'm not sure what the explanation for that is. Were there any red flags by Jarrid's physician, wife, friends, pastoral associates? Were there any red flags? We don't know. We'll have to find out. And I know that there are a lot of different questions that need to be answered so that we can understand this whole process better. But let's assume that there are things that can be done that can help people who are suffering from this problem. I think one of the things that churches can take away is that churches have to be smarter. They have to be more cautious. They have to think down the road and say, okay, if we hire this person who has this particular problem, what safeguards do we have to put in place to help this person not get himself into a position where he's going to relapse or fall into temptation? You know, the Bible is replete with warnings that, you know, if you think you fall, if you think you stand, take heed lest you fall. That when someone has fallen into sin, restore the individual gently, but be careful that you too don't fall into that same sin. So when people who have past experiences that give them a unique and extremely qualified perspective on a particular struggle or difficulty in life, they can be greatly used of God to help other people who have struggled in that same area, but they also are susceptible to falling back into that same sin or struggle. So what we have to do as Christians, we have to be very smart now, and we have to be wise now, and we have to learn from our mistakes. And so as Christians, we need to say, okay, we want to let the Lord use these individuals who have unique perspectives on past struggles because of their experiences, but at the same time, we want to be very, very careful that they're not just like anybody else, because actually most people are not, clinically depressed, or they're not struggling in the same way as a person who has like clinical depression or is on medication. Most people, most pastors are not struggling that way. But if there is someone who has talent and gifts and has a passion for helping people dealing with these problems, doesn't mean you don't bring them on staff. It doesn't mean that you don't use them. It just means that you have to think about this and be very careful, because that person that you're pushing out there or is asking to be put out there, they don't always need to be listened to. You can say, look, we need you to take a sabbatical, a step back from this, or we want you to be engaged in ministry for half a year and then take a month or two off and then go back. And because burnout happens in the ministry all the time, but when people are suffering from some kind of mental illness going into the ministry, that even makes it even more critical to be careful about this. So there's all kinds of questions. The goal would be to better understand the problem and thus prevent it from happening again, because this is a terrible tragedy, and we don't want to see this thing happen again and again and again. So I hope that's been a helpful word, and we'll see you back next week on another edition of Christian Answers. God bless.